This is our third lecture for week 6, and in this lecture we're moving from the prenatal period into infancy and looking specifically at how infants develop trust and form attachments. In this lecture we'll start by talking about the idea of trust and the importance of trust in infancy in relation to Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, and then we'll talk about the phases in terms of forming an attachment that occur during infancy and early childhood. So if you recall in week 5, in our week on self and identity, we talked about Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, the 8 stages that go from birth to death. And stage 1 is the stage in infancy, which is the stage of basic trust versus mistrust. And this occurs basically during the first year of life, and the task is to develop trust without completely eliminating the capacity for mistrust. So if you think about this, and in connection to our previous lecture, the baby is born and they leave the safety and security of the womb, where the temperature is regulated, the baby doesn't need to eat, all of its needs, physical needs are met, and comes into the world and has to rely on caregivers, has to rely on typically on parents to meet those needs for warmth and food and comfort. And so if the mom and the dad can, or whoever is the caregiver for the baby, can give the baby a degree of familiarity and consistency and continuity, then the infant will develop the feeling that the world, especially the social world, is a safe place to be, and people are reliable and they can meet your needs and they will be loving. But if the parents are unreliable, or they're not responding to needs, if they're rejecting the infant, if they're harming the infant, then this can cause the infant to develop mistrust and become apprehensive and suspicious around people. And if the proper balance is achieved, then the child will develop the virtue of hope, which is a strong belief that even when things are not going well, they will work out well in the end. So this is about being open to new experiences while still having some wariness that occurs when trust and mistrust are in balance. Knowing that there may be some discomfort or danger, but being open to having new experiences. And this all links in very well with attachment theory, which really suggests that attachment is formed when there's consistency in meeting a baby's needs, and that when that consistency is there and that feeling of trust is formed, then the infant will develop the comfort to explore, which also relates to this idea of hope, be open to new novel experiences, and use the parent as the secure base and the safe haven. So there's a very nice connection and overlap between Erikson's theory and the theory of attachment that we'll talk about in a minute. But just one more thing around Erikson's first stage. In terms of giving you an example, one sign that a child would be doing well in terms of establishing trust in this stage is when the child isn't overly upset by the need to wait a moment for the satisfaction of his or her needs, because there's a pattern there, and the child knows that mom and dad may not be perfect, but I trust them enough to believe that if they can't be here immediately, they will be here soon. So things may be tough now, but they'll work out in the end. And that's the strength of hope. And that is the same ability that later in life can get people through the disappointment in love and careers and other domains in life. And so that's the enduring strength that can be developed in the first year through the crisis of trust versus mistrust. So now we're going to transition to talk about attachment theory again, attachment theory that we talked about in week 4. And I just wanted to remind you about the core characteristics of attachment. And then we're going to talk about how attachment forms, the different phases of attachment, how it forms during infancy and the toddler years. But if you remember, we talked about the core characteristics of attachment during the tutorial session in week 4. And those are things like proximity maintenance, trying to maintain a close contact with the attachment figure, and being distressed, separation distress, when the child is apart from the attachment figure. And then using the attachment figure as a way to explore. So using the attachment figure as a secure base from which to explore, and a safe haven if something happens to go back to that attachment figure. So just keep that in mind as we talk about the formation of attachment. So John Bowlby, who's the person who developed attachment theory, and I talked about him in week 4, he proposed that there are 4 phases of attachment that occur, over the first, year and a half or so of life, really, which is the infancy years. And sometimes infancy is defined as the first year of life. Sometimes it's the first 18 months of life. But really, attachment is being formed, during the period of infancy. And so I'll go through each of these phases, but it starts with pre-attachment, which occurs from birth to about 6 or 8 weeks. Then goes into attachment in the making, from 6 to 8 weeks to 6 to 8 months. And then the idea of true or clear-cut attachment, where you really see those characteristics of attachment that I just talked about and that we talked about in week 4, around proximity maintenance and secure base, safe haven, separation distress. And then where children develop a little bit more sophistication in relationships, the reciprocal relationships, where they can start to be a true partner. And sometimes this is called goal-corrected partnerships. So now we'll look at each stage, or each phase. The first phase of forming an attachment is pre-attachment. So, and the book talks about, birth, and it's typically been thought that the stage of attachment, pre-attachment, starts at birth. But really, as we talked about in the first lecture this week, and talks about in the reading, the bond between the baby and the mother and other caregivers, and the father and partners, really begins to form even before birth. The parent can form an emotional attachment to the baby, and the baby becomes familiar with the voice of both the mother and mother's partner, father, and also they become, with the baby also will know the smell of his mother. So these connections are already being made even during the prenatal period, and so that can be also considered part of pre-attachment. But pre-attachment has typically been thought of as the ways in which the baby is also eliciting a connection from their caregiver. So you may remember in week 4, I talked about the evolutionary aspect of attachment. So Bowlby said the reason that we have attachment, we have these certain behaviors you see in young infants, is that, again, infants are dependent on caregivers for their survival. So they will engage in certain instinctual responses that attract the caregiver. So I showed you these photos already in week 4, but these are the kinds of attachment behaviors like clinging and crying and sucking and reaching that are instinctual, but they're around keeping the caregiver, attracting the caregiver's attention. And, this is where, this attachment forms because the parent or the attachment figure usually smiles back when they get these signals from the baby, and they will hold the baby, and they will respond to what the baby wants. And that starts to create a pattern of reciprocal behaviors and interactions that forms the basis of the attachment relationship. So again, babies are signaling through crying, through sucking, through clinging, through reaching, they want something, and then the parent responds, and that reciprocity comes into the relationship in terms of the interaction. So then from 6 to 8 weeks to 6 to 8 months, this is the phase called attachment in the making. And this is when attachment is forming. So the kinds of behaviors that form attachment, which is consistent attention to the child's needs, when that happens, an attachment pattern is formed. And so that could be the beginnings of a secure attachment, or it could be an insecure attachment of the kinds that we talked about in week 4, an insecure ambivalent resistant relationship where there's not a consistency in terms of meeting the baby's needs, and so sometimes the parent will meet the needs, sometimes not, and so there's an insecure ambivalent pattern that's formed. It could be insecure avoidant because the parent is intrusive or rejecting in some way when the baby is expressing a need, or it could be the insecure disorganized where there's some kind of trauma or abuse going on, and that parent is either scared or scary, that kind of fearful or causes fear, that kind of dynamic. But basically, this is when the responsiveness to the infant's needs lays down the pattern that is formed in terms of the relationship. And so you start to see, during this phase, that the infant will prefer the attachment figure, the caregiver, the consistent caregiver like their parent, and they will respond more positively to being comforted by that parent rather than a stranger or another caregiver. But still, children will often still go to another caregiver during this time. It's in the next phase where you see that they often will have more of the stranger danger happens around 9 months. So after that initial period, so from 6 to 8 months, sometimes 9 months, you can start to see a lot of attachment behaviors in an infant. So those core characteristics of attachment that we talked about in week 4 really become apparent in terms of children's behaviors, starting, let's say, around 8 months, getting into 9 months. And that's often when sort of stranger danger, stranger anxiety comes in, and that's often a sign that people talk about with new parents that up to that point, children may not really have been bothered very much by a new person, but often at that point it can be more difficult to introduce a new caregiver because the attachment is really becoming clear at that point. And so sometimes it's called clear-cut attachment as well. And so you see these behaviors that relate to the core characteristics of attachment, and they become apparent now in terms of the child's behaviors. So things like trying to remain near the attachment figure, like the mom or dad. That's a proximity maintenance characteristic. Protesting when the parent leaves, so having distress, separation distress. Exploring the novel environment, so going somewhere new, going to a playground, let's say, or new childcare center, but sort of looking back, is the attachment figure nearby, looking back to the attachment figure, and that's using the attachment figure as a secure base. And then going to the attachment figure when he or she has a need. So baby gets hurt or gets stuck or something, crying for mom and dad, crying for that attachment figure. So we see all these behaviors, starting, around this age, 6 to 8 months and later. And then the final stage that Bowlby described was the reciprocal relationship stage, which is also sometimes called the goal-corrected partnership stage. And so this happens really from when children are toddlers, getting into when they're 18 months and older, when they can start to really initiate interactions themselves. And so they're not always responding, or it's not always about a need. It's more about that interaction and the emotional interactions. And so toddlers can initiate interactions. They can ask, to read a book. They can, ask to go and play and do things with the attachment figure, negotiate with the attachment figure. And this is also a stage where you start to see social referencing. So that's another important characteristic of the attachment relationship, is that children use their attachment figures to start to develop their understanding of the world and their early emotions. Next week, we'll talk about emotional development, early emotional development, but social referencing, which comes from the attachment relationship, is part of that. So in a new situation, I mentioned this in week 4 too, someone new comes to the door, baby will look to mom, is this a friend? Or going to a new place or tasting something new, am I supposed to like this? So starting to look to the attachment figures for clues about how to interpret a new person or a new situation, a new experience. And also during this phase of reciprocal relationships, as the baby really becomes a toddler and gets older, they start to realize that the attachment figure will return. And so the separation distress can decrease during this stage when a toddler knows, okay, mom and dad is leaving me here in childcare, but they'll come back. Or I'm going to this babysitter, my grandparents, but mom and dad will come back for me. And that's really what continues in terms of the attachment relationships. We still see those core characteristics, but some of these become internalized again as the infant toddler internalizes trust in the attachment figure to meet the child's needs. So in week 4, we already talked about attachment types that formed in early childhood. So a secure attachment type where there is an establishment of trust that the infant knows that the caregiver will meet the child's needs, or an insecure attachment type where there's some kind of mistrust, and that's associated with different kinds of caregiver behaviors, whether not responding consistently or responding, but in a way that's intrusive or rejecting. So you can refer back to that lecture in terms of attachment types in early childhood. But just briefly, some different factors that affect attachment include the quality of caregiving. So this is really about responding promptly and consistently to the child's needs, and also being sensitive to the child. So, looking for the child's cues, responding to the child's cues. If the child's indicating that it's enough in terms of interaction, averting the gaze, sort of letting the child take the lead in that regard. Attachment's also affected by infant characteristics and temperament. So in week 5 we talked about infant temperament. There's the there's the sort of easy, the difficult, and the slow to warm up baby, and so that can the dynamic that's there in terms of the parent and the child around temperament can influence the attachment relationship, and other things also about the infant can influence the attachment relationship. The child has disability, or is premature, or has an illness, that can also impact upon the attachment relationship. And family circumstances can also affect the attachment relationship. So, if there's stress in the family, for example, and domestic violence we've talked about, so family dynamics can certainly impact on attachment. And then the parents' own internal working models, and we talked about internal working models in week 4, the parents' own attachment relationships and how they've reconciled their past in terms of forming relationships now with their own child, can also affect how they're able to respond and form a trusting relationship with their child. So various factors can influence caregiver behaviors towards children, and in turn, it's that relationship that's formed, the consistency and the sensitivity of the caregiver's response that affects attachment security. So again, we see attachment security when there is consistent meeting of the child's needs, and the child forms that trust. And then various kinds of attachment insecurity when there isn't that consistency with meeting needs. So one way that carers and parents can help children develop trust and to form secure attachments is through what's called serve and return interactions. So those are interactions, children initiate interactions all the time. So young children, babies, and infant will babble, gesture, cry, and if the adult responds with eye contact, with words, with touch, that helps to develop the child's brain. It strengthens the connections in the different parts of the brain around language, around social skills. And so it's a little bit like a game of tennis or ping pong or something. So there's a kind of back and forth with the child initiating and the parent responding, or the caregiver. And so when the caregivers are sensitive and responsive to the signals and the needs of a child, they provide an environment that has a lot of these serve and return types of interactions and experiences. And so when there are missing those kinds of interactions, that is a threat to children's development. It's a threat to their attachment security, and it's a threat to their development of their brain as well. So the architecture of the brain, the connections that are made, are based on the reinforcement from relationships and social context. So having an absence of, when a child initiates, if there's an absence of some kind of a response, that can harm positive, healthy development. The brain is not getting the positive stimulation it needs. And also, there's a double whammy because it also gets then flooded with stress because the child is expecting some kind of response in terms of the serve and return. And we'll see that in tutorial in week 6. We'll look at what happens in the Tronick still face experiment, where a child does not get what they expect from the mother in terms of a warm interaction. It's very stressful to the infant. So that's why this idea of serve and return is often used by psychologists and social workers who work with children and families to talk to parents about how they can support their children's development and help to build their child's brain in positive ways by making sure that there are a lot of serve and return types of interactions. The child's initiating with some kind of vocalization, pointing, gesturing, eye contact, and there's some response then from that caregiver showing interest and verbalizing back. That's really very positive for children, and it builds again their brain and also their basic trust in terms of Erikson, and is the foundation for a healthy attachment, a positive, secure attachment. And finally, the reading raises the question: how does the experience of childcare affect the attachment relationship between parents and children? So, this has been an area of controversy really ever since women joined the workforce, which would be, over the course of the 20th century, more and more women became part-time or full-time employed, and often then would put their children in childcare, part-time or full-time. And so there's been a lot of anxiety, a lot of social anxiety around, does childcare negatively impact the attachment relationship? And your reading talks about research that's been done that suggests that if children are in high quality childcare, that does not seem to be a negative impact in terms of the attachment relationship with parents. And children may form secondary attachments to their caregivers, that provide some of the feelings of a secure base and a safe haven while they're in the childcare environment. But we will talk more about childcare in terms of how the context of childcare and how childcare quality can affect children's development next week. So that's where we'll stop for this week. And we'll pick up some of the themes that we talked about this week around emotional development and the context of childcare in next week's material.